Hi again. John Stott in The Spirit, the Church, and the World, the Message of Acts. He's reached Corinth and Ephesus, chapters 18 and 19 of the book of Acts. And this is wonderful stuff if you're thinking of how to witness to Jehovah's Witnesses, because it tells us how Paul did his work. He went where the people were, and that in most cities was to the Jewish synagogue or to the central places of their culture, their marketplaces, even their universities, as we saw back in chapter 17. And why is that? Well, why is this Paul's method? Why is it so successful, as it still is today, by the way, across especially Asia? This has been the method the church has used, to go where the people are and to concentrate on the big cities first, because in the ancient world, at least, you made a penetration into the consciousness of the Roman Empire, let's say, by going where the Roman Empire was most powerful. And Corinth was a very big city. Ephesus was a very, very important city. Athens, where we just came from, was a less important city politically, but was obviously of vast importance in terms of culture. So here's how John Stott approaches the subject. The rise of urban civilization, wrote Professor Harvey Cox in The Secular City, is one of the hallmarks of our era. Urbanization, he continued, constitutes a massive change in the way men live together, as they have moved from tribe to town to technopolis. The urban experience includes a cluster of things like communications and mobility, the disintegration of traditional religion, impersonality and anonymity, human planning, control, and bureaucracy. And in the decayed inner cities of our time, we would have to add economic neglect, racial disadvantage, unemployment, poor housing and education, crime, violence, family breakdown, and tensions between the police and the community. In 1850, there were only 4 world-class cities of more than 1 million inhabitants. In 1980, there were 225. And by the year 2000, there may be 500. Or consider the so-called megalopolis, or megacity, of more than 10 million people. In 1950, only London and New York qualified. But by 2000, it is calculated that there will be 23 cities of this size, that is over 10 million, with Mexico City taking the lead at nearly 30 million inhabitants, and Sao Paulo and Tokyo following at nearly 25 million. Most of these megacities will be in the Third World, and only 4 will be in Europe and the United States. Already, 2/5 of the world's population are city dwellers. And by the end of the century, the ratio will be more like 1/2. This process of urbanization is a significant new fact of this century, constitutes a great challenge to the Christian church. On the one hand, there is an urgent need for Christian planners and architects, local government politicians, urban specialists, developers, and community social workers who will work for justice, peace, freedom, and beauty in the city. On the other, Christians need to move into the cities and experience the pains and pressures of living there in order to win city dwellers for Christ. Commuter Christianity, living in salubrious suburbia and commuting to an urban church, is no substitute for incarnational involvement. It seems to have been Paul's deliberate policy to move purposefully from one strategic city center to the next. What drew him to the cities was probably that they contained the Jewish synagogues, the larger populations, and the influential leaders. So, on his first missionary expedition, he visited Salamis and Paphos in Cyprus, and Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe in Galatia. On his second, he evangelized Philippi, Thessalonica, and Berea in Macedonia, and Athens and Corinth in Achaia, while during the greater part of his third journey he concentrated on Ephesus. Indeed, Luke deliberately describes how the gospel spread by the gradual establishment of radiating centers or sources of influence at certain salient points throughout a large part of the empire. It is true that some of the towns Paul visited were small and insignificant. This could not be said of Athens, Corinth, and Ephesus, however. It has been reckoned that Athens may have had less than 10,000 inhabitants, but that Ephesus, did I say Ephesus before? I should have said Athens. Athens may have had less than 10,000 inhabitants, but that Ephesus had 500,000. and that Corinth, at its zenith, had nearly 750,000. All three were leading cities of the Roman Empire, situated round the shores of the Aegean Sea, while Corinth and Ephesus were also provincial capitals. They could perhaps be characterized as follows. Athens was the intellectual center of the ancient world. As we saw in the last chapter, the city where Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Epicurus, and Zeno had all expounded their respective philosophies. It was the birthplace of democracy. Of the three famous universities of antiquity, that is, Alexandria, Tarsus, and Athens, Athens was the most distinguished. Although it has now declined, or rather had now declined from the peak of its brilliance, the brightest students still flock to it from all parts of the empire. For the world's younger intelligentsia, it retained an almost irresistible magnetism. Corinth was, above all, a great commercial center, a world-famous emporium, situated close to the isthmus, that's a word from my grade 9 geography, isthmus, which joined mainland Greece to the Peloponnesian Peninsula. It commanded the trade routes in all directions, not only north-south by land, but also east-west by sea. For before the Corinthian Canal was cut for 3.5 miles across the isthmus, there was a diolkos, or slipway, along which cargoes and even small vessels could be hauled, thus saving 200 miles of perilous navigation round the southern tip of the peninsula. In consequence, Corinth boasted two ports, Lycaeum on the Corinthian Gulf to the west, and Cenchrea on the Saronic Gulf to the east. Thus, through its two harbors, Corinth bestrode the isthmus with one foot planted in each sea, which led Horace to call it Bimaris, or two-seed. So Corinth was a city of seafarers, or of maritime merchants, and it is hardly surprising that Poseidon, the Greek god of the sea, whom the Romans called Neptune, was worshipped there. F.W. Farrar imagined its markets stocked with cosmopolitan goods, Arabian balsam, Egyptian papyrus, Phoenician dates, Libyan ivory, Babylonian carpets, Cilician goat's hair, Laconian wool, Phrygian slaves. Paul must have seen its strategic importance. If trade could radiate from Corinth in all directions, so could the gospel. Ephesus was also famed for its commerce. Barclay calls it the market of Asia Minor. It had political importance as well, as the capital of the Roman province of Asia. But in particular, Ephesus is one of the principal religious centers of the Greco-Roman world. The imperial cult flourished there, and at one time the city boasted as many as 3 temples dedicated to the worship of the emperor. Above all, Ephesus was famed as the guardian of the temple of Artemis. In classical mythology, Artemis, whom the Romans called Diana, was a virgin huntress, but in Ephesus she had somehow become identified with an Asian fertility goddess. Ephesus guarded with immense pride both her grotesque, many-breasted image, probably in origin a meteorite, and the magnificent temple which housed it. This structure had more than 100 Ionic pillars, each 60 feet high, and supporting a white marble roof. Being 4 times the size of the Parthenon in Athens and adorned by many beautiful paintings and sculptures, it was regarded as one of the 7 wonders of the world. In addition, under Diana's patronage, superstitions and occult practices of all kinds flourished, and the magic words and formulae which were sold to the credulous were known as Ephesian letters. Here then were 3 major cities of the Greco-Roman world, all of them in differing degrees being centers of learning, trade, and religion. Luke plainly understands their significance for the spread of the gospel. Having portrayed the Apostle Paul among the philosophers in Athens, he now describes his visits to Corinth and to Ephesus. These visits followed a similar pattern, namely the evangelization of Jews, their opposition to the gospel, the apostles' deliberate turn to the Gentiles, and the multiple vindication of his dramatic decision. This is Luke's underlying theme in chapters 18 and 19. First, in both cities, Paul began with a serious and sustained attempt to persuade his Jewish hearers in the synagogue that Jesus was the Christ. Secondly, in both cities, Paul responded to Jewish rejection of the gospel by leaving the synagogue and turning to Gentile evangelism, using as his base the house of Titius Justus in Corinth and the lecture hall of Tyrannus in Ephesus. Thirdly, in both cities, Paul's bold step was vindicated by many people hearing and believing the gospel. Fourthly, in both cities, Jesus confirmed his word and encouraged his apostle, in Corinth by a night vision, and in Ephesus by extraordinary miracles. Fifthly, in both cities, the Roman authorities dismissed the opposition and declared the legitimacy of the gospel. In Corinth, through the proconsul Gallio, and in Ephesus, through the town clerk. So, Paul in Corinth is the next subject of John Stott. Now, I'll put in a link to what's going on in the great urban centers of Asia, the Far East, as we used to call it. Michael Green on the exponential growth of Christianity in the Far East. How is it happening?